The cerebral cortex is the layer of cells on the outer surface of the cerebral hemispheres of the forebrain, associated with higher brain functions such as thought and action. It is made up of sulcus and gyrus that allow for more surface area of the brain while it remains proportional to the rest of the body. The cerebral cortex is divided into two hemispheres, right and left, which, although appear identical, differ slightly in their functions. The right hemisphere is often associated with creativity, while the left hemisphere is more so associated with logical activities. Communication between the two hemispheres occur via the corpus callosum and the anterior commissure, located in the center of the brain. The cerebral cortex is made up of laminae, which are layers of cell bodies that parallel the surface of the cortex and are separated by layers of fibers. The occipital lobe is located at the posterior end of the brain and is known as the primary visual cortex or the striate cortex due to its striped appearance. It receives projections from the retina via thalamus, which gives information about different visual stimuli such as color, orientation, shape, and motion. Since we need to be able to use the information that we see, the occipital lobe has neural pathways that reach other parts of the brain to be processed. One important pathway is the dorsal stream to the parietal lobe to process the location of objects. Another important pathway is the ventral stream that goes to the temporal lobes to process what the objects are. Destruction of any part of the occipital lobe causes cortical blindness, which is where there is no consciousness or perception of visuals, even if eye function and pupillary reflexes are normal. This means that the visual aspects of dreams or visual hallucinations also do not occur. The parietal lobe is located between the occipital lobe and the central sulcus, which is the distinct deep groove in the surface of the cortex of each hemisphere. The postcentral gyrus, known as the primary somatosensory cortex, is located just posterior to the central sulcus, receiving information from touch receptors, muscle stretch receptors, and joint receptors, while monitoring information about eye, head, and body position in interpreting visual and auditory information. It is also central to visual spatial navigation and reasoning, and assists in processing language, coordinating attention, and mapping the visual world around us. Research on the postcentral gyrus shows that separate areas along its structure receive simultaneous information from different parts of the body, combining information about light touch, deep touch, and combinations of both. Damage to the parietal lobe encompasses a broad range of deficits, including but not limited to right-left confusion, difficulty writing, language disorders, inability to perceive objects normally, neglecting part of the body or space, inability to control gaze and integrate components of visual scenes, or inability to accurately reach for an object, and so much more. The frontal lobe extends from the central sulcus to the anterior limit of the brain. It includes the precentral gyrus, which is a brain area specialized to control fine movements, known as the primary motor cortex. Much like the postcentral gyrus, research has been done to show that separate areas are responsible for movement in different parts of the body. The frontal lobe also includes the prefrontal cortex, in which dendrites have 16 times as many dendritic spines as neurons in other cortical areas, allowing it to contribute to many functions. The prefrontal cortex specifically is important in decision-making and planning movements, taking into account possible rewards, difficulty of action, probabilities of success and failure, and more. Unexpected outcomes therefore highly excite the cells in this area. The slow development of the prefrontal cortex, which does not occur approximately until the age of 25, accounts for the characteristic impulsivity of adolescents. The center for which they make rational decisions simply does not have the capacity to take into account long-term consequences. Similarly, damage to the prefrontal cortex can cause severe impulsivity because the brain no longer has the ability to weigh pros and cons. Also within the frontal lobe is a structure called Broca's area, which has the specific function of language output or language production. Damage to Broca's area is such that pronunciation of the words themselves are unimpaired, but the speech is nonsensical to an interpreter, often leaving out words, although sometimes still remaining grammatically correct. The frontal lobe is important in attention, such that it enhances the response of other brain areas to the most relevant information and decreases response to any distractors. It also plays an important role in working memory and in some aspects of emotion. On the whole, damage to the frontal lobe can cause judgment impairments, deteriorated attention span and organizational ability, and even loss in motivation and poor mood and emotion regulation. The temporal lobe is located in the lateral portion of the hemispheres near the temples. It is the primary auditory cortex and is thus the cortical target for auditory information and is essential for understanding language. It is also involved in the complex aspects of vision, such as facial expression, speech, memory, emotional and motivational behavior, and visual perception. Within the temporal lobe is a structure called Wernicke's area, which has the specific function of language output, or the processing of words that we hear. Damage to Wernicke's area causes severe impairment in comprehension of language, such that pronunciation cannot easily be understood, and speech itself consists mainly of nouns and verbs, with much difficulty in finding words. Damage to the temporal lobe can cause intricate and complex auditory and/or visual hallucinations. Damage to this lobe can also cause Kluver-Bucy syndrome, which leads to various abnormal behaviors such as irregular fear and anxiety behaviors. With such detailed understanding of the biopsychology of the human brain, many researchers and theorists have run into a problem, namely the binding problem. It is where, with so many different types of information coming from many different kinds of stimuli, there is a gap in the understanding of how all this information binds together to produce a unified perception and coordination of behavior. So far, researchers have not been able to explain binding, except that in order for it to occur, an individual must perceive the sensations simultaneously.